Well, hello YouTube, my name's Drew Arrett and I am trying to learn how to weld. Over here is my project bike, a 1998 Kawasaki Ninja 500. What my latest project was, my latest piece, was this little windscreen fairing, whatever you want to call it, right here. To learn how to weld this up, I've watched a lot of YouTube videos. I found several channels to be very informative. Those include Chuck E 2009, KingsMetalInc, and then also Eastwood, which happens to be the company that I bought my welder from. I have a little Eastwood MIG135 here that I'm learning on. So the process is very challenging for me. I learned a lot along the way. I am going to walk you through how I went about achieving this, and hopefully you'll learn a little bit of something too. That being said, let's get started.
So step number one, of course, you got to measure everything, right? How do you know what you're going to do unless you know what measurements you got? So I've already measured everything, and you can see here, I'm going through, I'm drawing everything out. I just used a piece of cardboard to start with because, you know, I don't want to waste metal and I don't want to miscut anything. So I'm just going through, drawing out my pattern, and then I cut out each little template. You'll see here in a moment that I will take these out and tape them up to make sure they all fit. Labeling them just so I know where they go out there. Don't get them mixed up on the way. You can see here they're all taped up. The top row did not turn out right. Bottom row looks good. Okay, so I had to go back through, figure out how I was going to get these the right measurements. I decided just to do a trace on another sheet of cardboard and then cut those out. You can see after I did that, all turned out good. Ready to go. So the next step was to draw out my templates onto steel and get those cut out. I just used a Sharpie, works real well on steel. You didn't see that sticker very well at the beginning, but this is 22 gauge sheet metal. So again, just drawing out my templates and labeling them. Of course, safety, earplugs, goggles, heavy canvas shirt, and of course a nice set of leather gloves. To cut these out, I just used a little high-speed cutting tool. I think I got this one from Harbor Freight for, I don't know, 20 bucks or something along those lines. You can buy tons and tons and tons of those metal cutting discs for cheap. So I cut out my templates, and then I just kind of shave the burrs off the outside of them. I'm sure there's better tools out there to do this with. Some sort of a snipping tool would be much more accurate, but this is the best tool I have for the job at this point in time. So right here, the metal gets too hot. Friction causes heat. And then I just finish up. Okay, everything I've looked at online talks about with welding, just like with painting or lots of other work along these lines, prep. So in order to get a good weld, you need to keep everything clean. So it's been a while since I welded up this frame, and I went through and cleaned it all up with a wire brush on my drill. Now this is showing you the chart. Actually, I shouldn't even be welding the sheet metal. It's too thin. So I looked at 20 gauge settings and I started with those. Clamping my ground, getting all ready. Again, safety first, welding helmet, nice heavy leather gauntlets, and then we're ready to weld. So even though I'm not technically, like, the welder wasn't technically supposed to be set up to weld this because I only had flux core. I don't have a gas setup yet. I was able to get some settings that worked for me. However, this first little bit, you can see that I'm playing around with the settings on the welder a lot, right? It was a lot of trial and error, weld a little bit. If it didn't go well, tweak the settings. Namely, I had to up the wire speed. I don't know if it's the MIG135 from Eastwood or if it's actually supposed to go that slow, but dialed all the way down, it was almost so slow that it wouldn't even come out. So I just had to crank it up a little bit. I still left the voltage fairly high. And so this first piece, it was a lot of trial and error. And that's kind of welding in general. Is you just got to do a lot of trial and error for what you're doing and get your settings dialed in right, and then it goes pretty well. The other thing I noticed is it's going pretty fast, but you can see that the gloves are even starting to burn at some points when I'm holding stuff in place to get it tacked in there. So even with those heavy gauntlets on, you got to be careful. Now, if you look at the welding technique I'm using, it's really just tack welding. The sheet metal is incredibly easy to burn through, and you've got to work really, really quickly. So you can see I just put maybe like 7-8 tacks on that piece, and so on and so forth. So again, I'm just tacking stuff in place. I'm still tweaking my settings at this point. You can see the gloves, the smoke rolling off my gauntlets there is it's starting to heat up. The other thing I would highly recommend is you see me lifting up my mask constantly. I don't have an auto dimming mask. I just bought a cheap one to begin with. But an auto dimming mask would be a great tool to have. So I slow the video down right here, so you can see what it looks like when you get your settings right. Because at this point, I really got my settings dialed in, and you can see how clean that weld looks, and you can see the heat marks around it. Good penetration. So once I got to this point, things started really moving quickly. It's really all about getting those settings dialed in. And then I'll show you here in a minute what those settings ended up being for me. Really, if I cared a lot about this and I had a lot of extra metal, I should have set up some practice runs first. However, I have a limited amount of metal, and there you can see how much better those welds look. So the settings that I got dialed in on were a voltage of about C is the setting on this, so it'd be like a 3 to a 4, and then the wire speed was about a 2. And like I said, once I got those settings dialed in, things really move. So I never had to mess with the settings again after that, and then you see I just start plugging away and just tack, 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 tack. Another technique that I found effective was to start on the bar, because it's thicker gauge metal, and once I got a nice pool going on the bar, I could kind of drag it over to the sheet metal, and then I wasn't focusing all my heat on the sheet metal, and I wouldn't burn through it nearly as easily. So that started being pretty effective and working really well, and I could move pretty fast. I should note that I did have to go through and trim up some of these metal pieces. Again, this bike is dirty and rough, and a lot of the work was done by just eyeballing it, and since I'm new to welding, it's not perfect by any means. So I had to tweak as I go and shave a little off here, a little off there, grind a little here, grind a little there. It's really a difficult process and a learning process, and I imagine I probably didn't do it quite right. So here's the final product. I'm happy with the way it turned out. It cleaned up really nice afterwards, and it was a great learning experience.